So it is likely this video might approach 30 minutes, and I apologize for that. But it is an important video, if for only one reason. It's sort of calling out Lego in a way, ripping the band-aid off, because Lego made a bad decision. I know this is not, this is a topic that I've actually covered already, and it's twofold here, because I want to talk very specifically about a very interesting piece that Lego has had made in its repertoire for literally decades at this point, and has seen use in thousands of sets. I also want to talk about a couple of mocks that I have built in front of me here, combination models for the protectors of 2015. We'll get back to those in a moment as well. And I want to talk about what is arguably one of the most notorious pieces from Lego's history, especially if you are a Technic, and more especially if you're a Bionicle fan. I'm going to bend down awkwardly to pick up this little thing right here, one of the containers that I use to organize my parts. But you'll notice, well, you might not notice, I notice that one of these bins is not like the other. It's first and foremost completely full, but it's also filled with some kind of random pieces, mostly the same individual piece though, and there's a reason for that. There are two bins, one right next to the other, that are basically the same piece. They are this piece, one for neutral colors, black, dark gray, light gray, etc., and one for, well, actual colors, like this one in sand green. Lovely color for that piece, by the way. But notably, this one right here is this piece. Looks like it's the same until you realize that it's just broken. That entire bin is filled with broken versions of this piece, except for that one right here, which is the broken version of another piece from a different bin. Ultimately, though, an entire bin full of these, and that's not all of them, that's just all I could fit in there. Why did these pieces exist from Lego for 20 plus years when that was never addressed until around 2018 to 2020, depending on who you ask, when this version of the piece finally came out? This version is notably different because when you look at it from this side, you'll see there's a little bit of a gap underneath the window that allows you to see that axle inside that axle connection. On the opposite side, though, that gap is missing, and instead there is a mold mark there. That's a good indicator that you have a good version of this piece, the modern version, which is much less prone to breaking from my experience. I don't have a crazy amount of these, and they have not been around for very long, so ultimately I cannot tell you if they will withstand the test of time, if you will, but it is baffling to me how this piece existed for 20 years, near about, and was just breaking left and right. Now, I know there is another notorious piece for Bionicle fans specifically that suffered from a very similar problem to this, notably these sockets right here, of which I have 6 different iterations in front of me, although one of them, because my camera sucks with the color red, is going to look basically identical to another one. We'll talk about that. But this right here is the first iteration of the original socket introduced before Bionicle, but predominantly used in Bionicle and other themes there. And you can tell that it is a Generation 1 version of this piece, or Iteration 1, and not Iteration 2, which is right next to me here, because it has a small little mold mark off to one side. I've actually talked about this piece specifically when the changeover happened from the mold mark being here to the mold mark moving to the center of the piece. I have no idea, but what I have noticed is that this piece is prone to breaking, don't get me wrong, but not in the way you might expect. Now, if you're familiar, if you ever hear the term fragile socket, the first thing that might come to your mind is the 2007 lime green sockets, specifically from the Holly Maury set, or potentially the 2008 socket from literally every set from 2008 up until 2010, even into 2011 in some cases. Wild to me that that piece also did not get addressed for so long. Actually, it did, which is a whole other problem. We'll get into it once we get into it. But what's wild to me is that this piece was actually not prone to breaking at the socket. I have had, and specifically the reason I chose dark turquoise for this video is because, as far as I know, this piece was exclusive to 1999. I could be wrong. There might be other sets that use this piece in this color, but as far as I know, I think it's only the Jungle Slicer set that uses them in this color, and then like maybe one other set. Ultimately, though, what I find quite baffling about this is that I can still use this piece to this day, if I can get this damn bone in here, and it just works. I've never had one of these break. Does not say it won't break, at least not at the socket, but it is prone to breaking elsewhere in the same way that this one is, notably the axle hole at the top. Now, I don't believe I've had any dark turquoise ones of this piece break specifically, but your mileage will vary. Anecdotes are anecdotes, whatever, right? That said, though, I do know that I've had these pieces break. Specifically, I know I've had a couple of purple ones, which I believe are also pretty exclusive to some early sets as well. So, we do know that the iteration 1 version, whatever, of this piece can break ultimately. And the second iteration can break. It's a little more prone to breaking for reasons I'll get into in a moment, but ultimately both of these are roughly about the same, to each their own, right? However, what I do find fascinating is that in 2007, technically in 2006, and I've heard anecdotes of this as well, LEGO had decided to approach a more sustainable plastic. I don't know the specifics of this. I don't know when the change happened exactly. I don't know what colors were affected by this. I don't even know if it's necessarily true, but I do know that there was a change, and we can attest to this if only because in 2007 we got the Holly Maury set. And of course, that set just would shatter when you looked at it. The lime green pieces on that set were horrendously bad. And it begs the question, why? Why are they bad on that set specifically? It's nothing to do with lime green in and of itself. 2005 gave us the Kalirak set with lime green parts. You had the Nui Rama for 2001, which had lime green parts in it as well. And those sockets were not prone to breaking, at least not at the socket portion of the piece. But of course, by the time you get 2007, that piece would explode on basically visuals, right? Which actually affected a few sets, notably Holly the most, because every version of Holly that I'm aware of is affected by this. Most versions of Elec, though not all, and I've talked about this in a previous video, are also affected by this. But it tells us that at some point in 2007 is when this change was made, because early copies of Elec were not affected by this, which is why some of those short double sockets in lime green do exist to this day and are still usable. It's baffling to me, though, that this would happen. Now, I understand. I get that sometimes, there is a color that exists within LEGO that's notoriously fragile, more fragile than others. We've run into this problem with colors like dark red, reddish brown, etc. But this lime green from 2007 seemed very special. And it's possible that LEGO didn't catch it because they were probably playtesting with older versions of the piece, right? Why would they need to make more for themselves to playtest? As far as they know, it's just the same piece as had been always used, and really up until this point didn't have much of a failure rate. I did hear that the Finrak set from 2006 at some point received a variant change where it actually changed out the gunmetal double sockets for dark bluish gray. I can't confirm this because every version of that set that I owned only ever had gunmetal versions of the double sockets, but I do know that those were fragile as well, and I always attributed that to just that being a metallic color. Yes, we had silver sockets from, the Borakal sets, but this was the first time we'd seen gunmetal sockets, so maybe it just had to do with that. I have no idea. But obviously, 2007 starts to sort of confirm that something's going on in the background. Something's changing here. So LEGO did address it, but they did not address it in the way that I think would have been most obvious. To me, if I produced 20 different flavors of ice cream and one had a problem with it, right? One was getting people sick, I would take that ice cream out, but I wouldn't try to reinvent ice cream. You know what I mean? Like, if everything else was fine and had been fine up until that point, many other companies have been, doing this for years past, or I had even been doing it for years past, I would get rid of the problematic one, but I wouldn't rebuild this from the ground up. You know what I mean? But LEGO opted for the second option, creating a brand new mold, which I should mention is expensive, by the way. Mold can cost upwards of $200,000 to even $300,000 for LEGO, which means that they really must have had a reason to do this. And they did it fairly quickly, too. Remember, Holly Maury came out in the second half, as far as I'm aware of, although I think that might have been a regional thing, but the second half of 2007. By 2008, every set was using this socket, with the exception of apparently one Exoforce set. Let's not get into that. What I find fascinating, though, is how long it took them to address this problem. It almost felt like a sunk cost. Here's the thing. In 2008, when this part was introduced, these parts were breaking quickly. Now, I have in fact owned prototypes from 2008, and I've noticed that in my prototypes, they used the classic style of socket. In fact, when I owned the Axelara prototype set, which now Duckbricks owns, the lime green pieces on that weren't even fragile. At least they hadn't cracked. I didn't take it apart for obvious reasons. It's a prototype, right? I wasn't going to risk that, but they weren't broken, which told me it was probably designed even with the older versions of the lime green sockets as well. Something from like Kalirak or early versions of the Elec set, right? Makes sense. All of those sockets were available in the Elec set. This was Liwa Fantoka on the Axelara set. So none of those sockets were new. So it makes sense that they would use the older style of socket. And then by the time they made this new mold, this is what was on the market. But it makes no sense to me that Lego wouldn't play test this at the very least, right? Because this is a company, it would be embarrassing if they didn't, is my point. Because this is a company that touted itself on its production quality. And it's also a company whose main product is plastic, right? Like, you really don't want that to go wrong. But it did. Clearly. And what was baffling to me even more so about this is that they did not fix this piece for 3.5 years. 2008, 2009, 2010, and even into 2011 with CCBS's introduction, all used variations of this piece. Kind of. Here's the thing. I held up a red version of this piece earlier in the video because these two pieces are not the same. Unfortunately, it's hard for me to show you that on camera because my camera sucks at picking up the color red. But just note that this is the 4th iteration on this socket. I'm trying to get the light to pick it up just right. There is a mold mark in the very center, directly below the axle on this version of the piece that is not on this piece here. There's also a slight difference in the axle on the side of the piece. I know it's hard to see, but check your own collection. You may have pieces like this as well. I will say, for what it's worth, I've had less of these break than this, but I've had both of these break in the same areas, relatively, right? And what I find most fascinating about this is that this is a piece that feels like it does everything wrong. When you look at the classic style of socket, one of the things it got very right, first off, is this sort of slope on the outside of the piece, which helps to direct force downward into where more of the bulk of the plastic is, so that when you are attaching a ball socket to it, it flexes, but a lot of that force goes into the socket and into the plastic rather than outward, right? Which is a problem with this one because this has more of a scalloped edge, which is going to direct that force out and away from where the ball socket is expanding to accept a ball joint. Furthermore, the fact that this has an angled connection on it is a huge problem. Here's the thing. Something you may not know, and this is more intuitive than anything. I am not somebody who is well-versed in like geometry and topology and things like that. But ultimately, what my mind is telling me here, right, is that this being a perfect circular shape here, perfect as my eyes can detect anyway, means that when the ball joint goes into it, that force is going to be distributed along that length relatively equally. And the reason for this is that a circle is the lowest surface area to contain the area within it, right? So this means that there's nowhere specific for the sort of stretching forces, for the flexible forces in this piece to sort of gravitate to. However, because these pieces have these corners on it, means there's areas of plastic that are a little thicker, then a little thinner, then a little thicker, then a little thinner. And what this is going to end up doing is it's going to distribute those forces unequally, which you will note if you own this piece and you've had it break, it usually breaks in one of 3 places: directly in the center of the socket, or usually right down this edge here, basically connecting where that scallop ends into the ball joint here. And the main reason for these breaks is that this piece has to expand in its side dimensions, and it has to expand in its width dimensions. I'm describing that terribly, but ultimately what I'm trying to say is that this piece is going to break, and you might be able to confirm this. Hell, this piece has even got a crack starting to develop in exactly the point that I was just talking about. That's kind of funny. Again, you can't see it. My camera does not have the fidelity or the quality for that, and again, colors are a bitch. Anyway, but what I find fascinating about this is the fact that Lego spent all this money on this piece and it did not work. It just didn't. Lego had to have known that because they addressed this, but they did not address it by going back to the piece that previously worked, by going back to what wasn't broken, right? We already established that it wasn't the previous socket that was broken, it was a previous color. It was one flavor. But instead of going back to these molds that I imagine they may have still had up until this point, maybe they destroyed them. I have no idea, but it wouldn't matter anyway, right? Because this version is a new mold for this piece. So if they were going to make a new mold, why not go back to what was already proven to work? Why not go back to this? If you've created this piece up until this point in 18 or 20 or whatever, how many ever colors, right? And you only had one of those colors routinely fail, That tells you something about that color, not that part. Why change the part? And then when you notice that all of these are failing, no matter the color, why stick with the part? That makes no sense to me. Obviously, again, LEGO would address this, but it would take them a few years, bafflingly longer than it took them to address the lime green color from the previous socket iteration. And they would ultimately release what I have heard a lot of people call the best socket from LEGO, the CCBS style socket, which has another iteration as of today. I'm still classifying these as the same type of socket overall, just because they are ultimately the same dimensions, the same sort of outward appearance, but they are different, right? Ultimately, we're not talking too much about this piece. I don't own enough of these, nor have I had enough experience with this piece to really tell if this one is fragile, but I don't understand why people call this the best socket. As somebody who has designed over 200 mocks, specifically of a classic style, who has built thousands of Bionicle sets, almost exclusively using this piece, I have rarely, it's not to say I haven't had it happen, I absolutely have, but rarely had one break at the socket specifically. Notably lime green, of course, makes sense. There is a slight visual difference between the Kali Rock and Nui Rama lime green, by the way, and the Holly or 2007 lime green. I'm not going to get into that in this video. There's no way I'd be able to show it on camera anyway. Ultimately, doesn't matter. But it is worth noting that I have had CCBS sockets break. More so than the classic style socket, and it is a socket I use far less. So from an exposure point of view alone, you would think that at the very least, if these are going to break in similar places, they'd break in similar ways, but no. And this is why I wanted to get into my CCBS builds very quickly. This is a build I came up with probably at some point in 2023 or 2024, though I cannot tell you exactly when. I don't remember. I did post about it over on the Discord when I made it, so I can find it if I look. Ultimately, though, what I find baffling about this is that I designed this. This is made from the water, ice, and jungle protectors. In this case, I've got one also in front of me made from fire, stone, and earth, but they both suffer from the same problem. I built these, I left them together, displayed, not in this room, elsewhere, but built fully. And what I've noticed is that the sockets on these sets have all started to develop cracks just from being assembled, not from being played with. I'm not somebody that usually plays with my Bionicle sets. I usually build them, display them, or showcase them on video, but ultimately these are not seeing rugged play, right? And yet, developing cracks on both of these Beast feet in particular in this set are notable because many of them have developed cracks. I want to showcase the other protector here as well, the fire version, which, by the way, that is a bootleg mask in case you're wondering. But I'm using 4 of the beast feet on the back. All 4 of those have cracks on them. These are not the only pieces. By the way, I've had the heads from the G2 sets develop cracks. I've had several bone pieces, several socket pieces, several friction adder pieces develop cracks. Some even break entirely. I've had some of these bone pieces break as well. And it's wild to me that this is the case and that so many people still stand by CCBS as the best of the sockets. And I understand it. Again, from a sort of intuitive standpoint, this fixes everything wrong with the previous version, right? It goes back to a round connection. In fact, thicker than the original. The plastic there is thicker. You can no longer fit an axle through those through those holes in the side of the socket in the way that you could with this version here. It is also worth noting that it does not slope at all on the sides. Even the original version sloped, which means ultimately that this has more plastic material in general than this. I imagine if I weighed these two pieces, this would weigh more if I had a scale that was appropriate. My scale sucks, whatever. Point being, it is fascinating that these pieces break, which tells me it's not solely about the design. There's no reason that this piece should break. To some degree, I get it. Adding too much of a plastic takes flex away from a piece, but adding not enough plastic means that there's not enough material to resist cracking, right? It is a delicate balance for what it's worth. But it is also worth noting, at least from my experience, that the older plastics that Lego used in the 2000s were better equipped to flexing. Now, is this still true today? I don't know. But at least through the late 2000s, right? And in through most of the 2010s, Lego had a plastic that they were using for sockets that was not quite as good at flexing as the original sockets were. And now I have done, not on camera this time, but I have done extensive testing as well to test if, well, maybe the friction of these CCBS joints is better than the originals. But at least from my testing, that does not appear to be the case. It is not worse. It is on par with the friction of the original sockets. And I know that there are some people who have said that these sockets can become loose over time, the original versions specifically. And I think that's more, again, of a case-by-case basis. I absolutely have some sockets that are more frictionless, let's say, than others, that don't quite hold up than others, but it doesn't seem to matter which iteration that socket is. Just ultimately that some sockets are prone to losing friction over time. And I'm sure it also has to do with the amount of stress that they have to hold up, because again, when these pieces are assembled, one of the unique things about them is that they are constantly under stress from that point on. This doesn't go from being stressed, having a spike of stress, and then going back to its original stress-free, I guess, existence, right? But it is always under at least a little bit of stress, because ultimately that is what is supplying you the friction that is needed for a piece like this to do its main job. So that's something you have to tackle, right? But it is interesting to me, I will say. And I have had some people say, well, maybe it's a problem with metallic plastics specifically. Maybe they're more prone to breaking because they're metallic. They have, inclusions in them to give them their metallic sheen, but ultimately that's going to disrupt the bonds in this plastic that hold the plastic together. And that may be true. That is at least true in part when it comes to like resins and things like that. So it probably is true for the sake of plastic as well, but I have to imagine the changes here are relatively marginal. It's also worth noting that for the most part, the grains, if you will, of metallic material that Lego uses, whatever they may be, whether they're metal, whether they are mica, whether they're some other proprietary material, I don't know, are so fine that I don't think it matters much. But what about polycarbonate, right? The transparent material that Lego tends to use. I've also heard some people say, well, that's just not a material that's good for making sockets. But then I again bring up this. This is the socket from the Rockshi in transparent neon orange. I have never had one of these break before, which I think is actually more of a statement on this piece. Now, Lego only ever made this version of socket in 3 transparent colors: trans neon orange, trans standard orange, and then trans medium blue, although there's some variation there as well. I've never had one break of any type, not only at the socket, but even at the axle as well. Polycarbonate is an interesting material because it is strong like ABS, although I don't know if the strengths are comparable because they are used for different purposes, but it is also a notably flexible material. There's a reason why polycarbonate typically is used for things like plexiglass and Lexan and all this other stuff. Whatever the brand name is, I don't know, doesn't matter. But I have seen sheets of polycarbonate, a half an inch thick or less, that have been able to hold up the weight of an entire person. So to see it used in something like this, I don't expect it to crack, because I don't imagine that this is putting that much stress on that piece. It is putting a lot, for what it's worth. Ultimately, I am not a material scientist or anything like that. I am just a guy who enjoys Lego, who has seen and has experienced firsthand the decades of change that Lego, that Bionicle, that Technic, and all of that have gone through. And I've seen, for what it's worth, some notable changes in the last few years to actually address a lot of these problems. This is not the only piece to get a new mold, mind you. Basically every piece to have this version of an axle connection, which is a little bit thinner here, it allows certain types of gears to actually pass, which is a really cool thing. Separate topic. Ultimately, nearly all of them that have had this connection have received a change, and I am very thankful for that. This may be one of the few, although I only own a few from recent years, that did not receive a change, but I have not noticed this version break. Again, having only maybe like 10 of those in my collection total means I am not an expert on this piece. Whether or not they will withstand the test of time, we'll just have to see. you know? But it is worth noting at the very least that a company that is dedicated, so dedicated to its plastic material, would so quickly address the problem with the Holly Maury lime green color, obviously addressing it in the wrong way, in my opinion, but I think I'm probably in the majority saying it that way as well, but then would so slowly address the problem with the new socket they made. This is, I also want to just very plainly state, I am somebody who is a big fan of Lego, has been a fan of Lego since the 2000s. This feels like a product that is recall worthy as well. I should mention that. And I say that in the sense that small bits of sharp plastic that could very easily be eaten, obviously, that feels like that is something that could have been prime for a lawsuit. The only thing that I think kind of nullifies this is that Lego does at the very least put on most of its packaging, you know, not for kids, contains small parts, which I don't know if that's applicable here, right? Ultimately, these aren't small parts. These are parts that were designed large but broke into small, sharp shards, right? And that feels like a slightly different can of worms, if you will. Oh, I'm sure, like I said, that people probably thought about, you know, class action lawsuit. And again, I'm not like wishing for this stuff to have happened because, again, I do like Lego. But it is also worth noting that Lego is a wealthy, a very successful company. These are things that today they could absolutely fix. There are a lot of people who are also very blind fans when it comes to Lego that will ultimately just let Lego get away with anything. I am not one of those people, for what it's worth. I am glad. I think the world is a better place for Lego's existence. Obviously, I love to see a lot of the changes that they make, and they're prone to making mistakes. They are allowed to make mistakes. Everybody is. But you should, it's how you address your mistakes that really speaks to yourself as a company. And it's also worth saying, too, that Lego 2024 is not the same as Lego 2008, 2007, 2009, 10, 11, whatever, right? Those were obviously very different times, both in terms of the market in general, but also in terms of the company as well. Would Lego fix this problem today? I think, yeah, probably. If this is anything to go by, this change right here, and it's not the only change Lego's made. Lego's also made a change and actually addressed the problem with reddish brown being one of the most notoriously fragile colors. That's more of a color that is fragile with time, typically. So usually, and this is a problem that Lego's had in the past as well, it wasn't so much a problem when the part came out, but with time the plastic would seem to degrade a little faster than others due to whatever pigment they were using, right? This is a problem that also existed, funnily enough, in 2007, notably with standard blue from Lego, Mata blue, Galley blue, whatever color you want to call this, right? And it is worth noting, you can see it maybe if you own sets from 2007. I could show you if I have a piece available here as well. In this bin of lift arms here, I have a beam. In fact, it's right in front of me, and I want to get two. These two beams are the same color. My camera sucks, so it's not picking up the color difference very well, but just know, and I'll post a picture of this over on the Discord as well, this is nowhere close to Mata blue. This is almost like dark turquoise, right? It feels like it could be in this color family. This color, of course, being dark turquoise, teal, terracotta color, whatever you want to call it, right? It really feels, maybe that actually helps you kind of see the difference in color a little bit. And remember, my camera is not doing this justice. It makes this look a little bit closer to the Mata blue than it actually is. Ultimately, though, that color is not just off from original blue, it is extremely fragile as well. Now, I'm not expecting this piece to break because I don't even really plan to build with the color ultimately. It's not even a bad color necessarily. It's kind of an interesting one, and I almost want to use it just for fun. But where it does go wrong specifically has to do with stud pins specifically. And I'm going to try and pull one of these off of this set here in a moment. This pin right here, I want to pull this spear out, but I kind of got it stuck in there. But that pin right there is a standard pin with a stud on one side. These pieces are available in light bluish gray, old light gray, but also in blue, standard blue. And in 2007 specifically, a lot of the Baraki used them in that color to hold the little Exoforce clips that would hold onto their squid pieces, whatever. It is worth noting that those pieces can explode, just straight up explode. Like, it's really bad. So anyway, that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Hopefully you learned a little bit about the history of these pieces. History, I say, as if I'm like some expert. But in general, it is promising to see the changes that LEGO is making to these pieces. I don't know, just bring back Bionicle. I'm joking, of course. I'll see you all in the next one. Of course, you can check out the Discord, Instagram, everything else down in the description below. Patreon is down there as well if you want to help support the channel. And yeah, if you like long content like this, also let me know that in the comments. And let me know your thoughts specifically on fragile pieces. Are there any pieces out there that you would consider strangely fragile? Not these pieces notably made or talked about in this video, but pieces that you think shouldn't be fragile, but just kind of are. I think thin lift arms are a really obvious one. Anyway, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.